Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
You guys requested this one, really wanted us to dig into the potential risks of AI, especially as it relates to the global economy.
Yeah.
And we found a podcast that really does a phenomenal job of diving into this topic.
And looking at both sides of the coin, really, because on the one hand,
we hear a lot about this potential multi-trillion-dollar boost that AI could give to the global economy.
absolutely.
But on the other hand, there are some risks.
Oh, yeah.
Some dangers that we need to be aware of.
For sure.
And that we need to be ready for.
Yeah.
And this podcast really does a good job of teasing out some of those.
And really diving into some specifics.
I think one of the things that I found really fascinating was just the concept of things like deepfakes.
Right.
That AI is being used to create these incredibly realistic fake videos and fake audio.
Absolutely.
And when you start thinking about the implications of that for misinformation,
Oh, yeah.
for political manipulation,
Huge.
it gets a little unnerving.
It's a little scary.
Yeah. So that's kind of what we're going to be diving into today.
Yeah.
And maybe before we get too far into it,
Let's just take a step back and make sure that we're all on the same page.
about what we actually mean
Right.
when we say AI.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's such a buzzword these days that it's easy to sort of throw it around without really defining what it is that we're talking about.
Right.
But when we say AI, we're talking about machines that can essentially mimic human intelligence, right?
Right.
So being able to perform tasks that usually require a human to think.
Right. Like when your virtual assistant
Exactly.
understands your question
Yep.
and
Like-
gives you a helpful answer.
Totally.
Or when you see those self-driving cars,
Yeah,
navigating traffic.
exactly.
It seems like AI is everywhere we look,
It really is.
even if we don't always realize it.
Yeah, it's becoming more and more pervasive. And I think that's why
Right.
it's so important to understand the potential downsides.
Because the more embedded it becomes in our lives, the more significant those downsides could be.
Right.
So one of the most concerning issues highlighted in the podcast is this idea of the black box problem.
Okay, let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah.
What is the black box problem?
So the black box problem essentially refers to the fact that it's often really difficult, if not impossible, to actually understand how these AI systems are arriving at their decisions.
Okay.
Right? So they take in all this data,
They spit out an answer.
and we don't necessarily know what happens in between.
So it's not always clear how it got from point A to point B.
Exactly.
Interesting. Okay.
And this can be a real problem, right?
Yep.
Imagine applying for a loan and being rejected by an AI.
Right.
Or even more critical, receiving some kind of medical diagnosis that's influenced by an algorithm.
Right.
If you don't understand why the AI made that decision.
It can be incredibly difficult to trust it or even to challenge it, even if the stakes are incredibly high, as they often are in situations like that.
Yeah, especially when you're talking about like healthcare and finance.
Absolutely.
Areas where we really rely on expert judgment
Yes.
and need to understand the reasoning behind the decisions.
Right.
So that's really interesting.
Yeah. And this is why the podcast really stresses the importance of responsible AI development.
Okay.
And it highlights three main approaches.
Explainable AI, human in the loop, and AI ethics by design.
Okay.
And at least in theory, these aim to address some of these concerns.
They sound promising, but are they really enough?
Yeah.
Is that going to be enough to really address these challenges?
Right. I mean, it's one thing to have these principles,
Right.
but implementing them is a whole other story.
In the real world.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And this is where I think the rubber meets the road, right?
Yeah.
Because
Companies are under immense pressure to innovate quickly.
to be the first to market with the next big thing,
Right. And in that race to the finish line,
ethical considerations,
they can sometimes take a backseat.
they can fall by the wayside.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's tough.
Yeah. It's that age-old dilemma,
Exactly.
progress versus responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it makes you wonder, if you are in charge of a company.
That was on the cutting edge of AI development.
Yeah.
How would you balance those two things?
The desire to innovate and stay ahead of the competition,
Right.
but also the responsibility to develop this technology ethically
Right.
and transparently.
Yeah.
How do you balance those two?
It's a tough one.
It is.
Yeah, it really is a tough one, isn't it?
It is.
And nowhere are those pressures felt more, I think.
Then when you look at AI's potential impact on the global economy as a whole.
Yeah, you're talking about a massive, massive shift, potentially.
I mean, the podcast throws out some big numbers.
It does.
Talking about a potential $15 trillion boost
Right.
to the global economy by 2030.
It's almost hard to fathom a number that big.
An insane amount of money.
Yeah.
But the flip side of that is massive job displacement.
Right. And that's one of those things.
Where it's like, it's one thing to hear it in the abstract.
Yeah.
But this podcast really, I think, drives home the scale
of the potential impact here.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about individual jobs here. We're talking about entire industries
Absolutely.
that could be transformed.
Yeah, completely.
And we're talking about transportation, manufacturing.
And healthcare even.
Healthcare. I mean, just massive changes.
Across the board, yeah.
And really the thing that's so
difficult to wrap your head around is the speed
it's happening so fast.
at which this is all happening.
Yeah, faster than most people can even comprehend, I think.
It really is.
And I think that pace of change is what makes it so challenging, right? Because
It's not just about the raw number of jobs lost. It's about, are we creating new jobs?
right.
Are we training people for the right jobs?
Are we equipping people with the skills they need to thrive in this new economy?
Yeah. Are our education systems
Right.
keeping...
Our job training programs,
Are we preparing people for a future where...
AI is the driving force in the workplace.
Yeah, it feels like we need to rethink a lot of this stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. And there's another layer to this, too.
Okay.
The podcast brought up this idea of data colonialism.
Data colonialism.
Yeah.
That sounds ominous.
It does, doesn't it?
What is data colonialism?
So essentially, it's this idea.
That whoever controls the data,
Okay.
which is the raw material that AI thrives on, right?
They're going to wield a disproportionate amount of power,
Oh, interesting.
both economic and technological.
It's almost like this digital divide
Totally.
on steroids, where it's like access to data,
Access to data is the new
wealth gap, essentially.
the new haves and have-nots.
Exactly. So it's not just about ethics in a vacuum, right?
Yeah.
It's about...
The societal implications of AI and how it could exacerbate existing inequalities.
It's a lot to think about.
It's heavy stuff.
And as if all that weren't enough.
Right. We've got potential economic upheaval.
Yeah.
We've got data colonialism potentially happening.
But even beyond that, there were some very specific risks associated with AI itself.
Oh, yeah, totally. We talked about the black box problem,
Wow.
but there's also this whole other issue of bias in AI.
Okay, so talk to me about that, because I've heard a little bit about this,
Yeah.
but I'd love to kind of dig in a little deeper.
Yeah, so AI systems, they learn from data, right?
Right.
Massive, massive sets of data.
And if that data reflects the biases that already exist in our world,
Sure.
guess what? The AI is going to learn those biases.
Right, so we're almost like baking these biases
Totally.
into the system.
It's perpetuating those biases.
That's supposed to be completely objective.
Yeah, and that's the thing. People think algorithms,
Right.
they're objective, they're data-driven, but the data
The
itself
data is flawed.
is flawed. Exactly.
Right.
And so the podcast gave a really, I thought, chilling example
Okay.
of how this can play out.
They were talking about hiring algorithms
Okay.
and how if an algorithm is trained on a biased data set,
It could end up discriminating against certain groups of people.
which is terrifying
Yeah.
because you would think that using algorithms in hiring
Right. You would think it would be more fair.
would actually reduce bias, not make it worse.
Right. Exactly. And then on top of that, there's the potential for weaponization of AI.
Oh, gosh, don't even get me started.
Right. Talk about scary.
I mean, that's where this stuff gets really real
Totally.
because the podcast talks about things like autonomous drones in warfare.
Right. Straight out of a sci-fi movie.
I mean, it sounds like we're living in a movie.
It really does.
When you think about the implications of that,
And it's not just the physical warfare aspect.
think about cyber attacks.
Right.
Large-scale cyber attacks driven by AI.
Targeting infrastructure.
Exactly.
Spreading misinformation.
Yeah. Disrupting entire systems.
It's scary stuff.
It really is. And it's not hypothetical, right? This is
Right.
like, we need to be ready for this.
This is the world we're living in.
And I think it just highlights.
The higher the stakes become when we're talking about AI,
Yeah.
the more important it is to consider these risks.
And it makes you wonder, too, with all this talk about data.
Right. AI's hunger for data.
It needs data
It needs it.
to function, to learn, to improve.
Where does privacy fit in?
Right.
We didn't talk a ton about that.
But yeah, that's the big question, isn't it?
It feels like it's always this trade-off
It's a constant tension, right?
between AI needs all this data.
But also we have a right to privacy.
Yeah, and who gets to decide
Right.
how that data is used?
Right, especially when we think about data breaches
Oh, yeah.
that are happening all the time.
Constantly.
It's unnerving.
It is. It makes you wonder if there's any way to have it both,
Right.
To have the benefits of AI without sacrificing our privacy.
It's a tough one.
And the podcast, do they offer any solutions?
They do. They touch on a few.
One that stood out to me was this idea of global standards
Okay.
and regulations
For AI development,
for data privacy.
which sounds great in theory, but
Yeah,
getting everybody on the same page.
that's the challenge, isn't it?
Right.
Getting all the different countries,
With all their different priorities.
their different agendas.
Yeah.
It's tough. It's like herding cats, right?
Yeah. It feels like it'd be virtually impossible.
Almost.
Yeah.
It's a good analogy.
So yeah, if we can't get global cooperation.
What are we left with?
Right.
Like, what's the alternative?
Well, and that's the thing, right? Because the alternative is,
Every country for themselves.
Right.
Every company.
oh, so it could be even worse.
It could be a Wild West
Right.
out there in terms of AI development,
Right. Right.
which is a scary thought.
It is. So global cooperation.
Maybe not super likely in the short term.
That's a long-term goal.
Yeah.
Right. What can we do right now?
Right.
What are some things that we can be thinking about?
To address some of these risks
Well, I mean, one thing the podcast talked about.
was encouraging companies
Right.
to take the ethical high ground,
Right. To self-regulate.
even without being forced to.
Right. Right. But how realistic is that?
Right, because it's not just about good intentions, is it?
Right.
It's about market forces.
Right.
Right. Competition.
They want to be profitable.
Exactly.
So how do you balance that?
Right. A company might say, yeah, we want to develop AI responsibly.
But if it means falling behind their competitors,
Right.
or if it means losing, a huge chunk of their profit margin,
Right.
suddenly it becomes a much tougher decision.
It does.
And that's why it's so important.
For consumers,
Yes.
for citizens,
Yes.
to be informed and engaged in this conversation.
Yes, 100%.
Because the more we understand about this technology,
The more we can demand transparency, accountability from the companies and governments developing it.
right, we can't just sit back and let this happen.
We can't be passive bystanders,
We
right?
have to be participants in shaping this future.
Exactly.
Well said. Well said.
So yeah, it's a lot to think about. It's a lot to unpack.
It is, as always.
But hopefully this deep dive has been helpful
I think so.
in at least, getting the conversation started.
Yeah, sparking some curiosity.
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always the goal here, is to,
Just kind of introduce these ideas
and then encourage you, the listener,
to keep digging, yeah.
to keep digging.
To keep learning.
Do your own research.
Because this is really just the tip of the iceberg.
It is. It really is.
And there's so much more to explore.
And who knows?
Maybe we'll revisit this in a future episode.
Definitely. This is a topic we're going to have to come back to.
Yeah, I think so, with all the new developments happening all the time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, this was fascinating.
It was a good one. Yeah.
Always a pleasure chatting with you.
Likewise. Always a good time.
And everyone listening, thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Yeah. Thanks for being here.
We'll catch you next time.
See you later.